the mind is flourishing like an orchestra. So the mind has multiple different functional elements. We sense, we image, we feel, we think, we behave with our bodies. When all of that is functioning well, it's like the brass, strings, the woodwinds, and the percussion, they're all coming together, but they need a conductor. And it won't just figure this out on its own. It needs another human relationship, other human relationships to help me learn. When this is happening, and we talk about secure attachment in parent-child relationships that enable the child to grow into a person who has the Berlin Philharmonic. What shame does, shame brings a 4x4 pickup truck into the orchestra hall and just runs over the whole show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Naked Gospel. I am your host, Shane O'Neill. Welcome to 2021. 2020 was a rough year. It's a rough year. I think I went to 4 funerals last year. And I know the difference between December and January doesn't feel like much, but it does give us new ways to anticipate, new ways to practice hope. To that end, we're bringing on a guest. His name's Dr. Curt Thompson. He's a trained psychiatrist. He's been practicing for a bunch of years up in the kind of greater Washington, D.C. area. And he's written, and he's a researcher, so he's written quite a bit on the intersection between spiritual formation and neurobiology, basically like what's happening with our bodies as we move toward Jesus and how to be more intelligible and intentional when we do that. He's also done work when it comes to like shame. Shame is kind of a word that either sounds cliche to me or is a word I just want to avoid. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I don't know what happens in my brain. I don't really know how to combat shame necessarily. Guilt, sure, I can reconcile with a friend, but shame when it comes to regret, when it comes to hiding, and when it comes to embracing busyness so that I can avoid the chaos that's taking place within me. And I see so many of us do that. I remember Eugene Peterson said something like, the great idol of our generation is our addiction to busyness. And I want to look at that with you guys. I want to understand that better. I want to know how Jesus steps into that space. I want to know how to go after shame because it's a gnarly thing to live with. It's a gnarly thing to avoid. There are certain memories I avoid just because I don't like how they feel when I go to them. So at the very least, this will be helpful for me. If you like this episode, share it with somebody that you think would benefit from it. And comments and likes and shares are always welcome. But really just glad you guys are joining us. And let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Dr. Curt Thompson. Curt, thank you so much for joining us today. Really thrilled to have you on. It's been interesting preparing for this. So I read your book twice, The Soul of Shame, over the last week, which wrecked my junk and in all the right ways. But it's been interesting preparing for this because I've noticed anxiety and not just anxiety. I don't necessarily think you're scary, but the topic is scary.
Give me a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole new level of anxiety that I'll prepare for right now. But the topic itself is intimidating. But before I'm getting ahead of myself, would you mind just sharing just a brief bio about yourself for our audience members?
Sure. So I think what I would want people to know is that I've been married for 34 years and we have 2 adult children, one daughter who's married and living in Nashville, and our son who's local but in grad school. And I grew up in Ohio, and I'm the youngest of 4 sons, actually all of whom at this point are no longer living, but that's an important part of my story. And for a living, I am a psychiatrist, so I treat patients, I treat individuals, couples, we run group processes, which I think we may end up talking a little bit about here in our practice, and have been doing that for about 30 years. And I think that I tell people a couple of important things in addition. One is that I am a professional sinner. like, it's like go big or go home. Yeah. And so it's what I do.
Yeah.
Right. And what I mean by that is that, there's like the older I get, the more I get, his mercies are new every morning, because like I can't live off of yesterday's mercy.
Yeah.
Right? Because I've got too much potential to go down the wrong road today. I need new, fresh mercy.
Yeah.
And I think that in my day job, what I do for a living, I think that ultimately what we try to do with the combination of neuroscience and storytelling and psychotherapy work and all those kinds of things in a number of different ways, we're really trying to help people tell their story more truly. And what that means for us is, what does it mean for us to tell our story truly in light of the true story in which we believe the gospel tells us that we're living? And so for me, Christian faith is not really so much just a belief system as much as it's a matter of like waking up to the story I'm in the middle of. And discerning and responding to the call of that storyteller, and recognizing that, there are plenty of times when I just want to tell the story the way I want to tell it. Yeah. And that, to the point of our topic of shame, I think that evil wields that as a way to both keep me blind to the real story, has me telling my story the way that I want to tell it by myself. Yeah. And ultimately leads toward my being devoured by evil and by myself and by the world, and mostly also keeps me from ultimately living into the thing that I was most created to bear image of God as, and that is as a creator. And so the whole notion of beauty and the notion of what does it mean for us to create the next beautiful artifact in the world, whether that's a relationship or software. That's another thing that I think that mostly that evil wields shame as a way to shear off our capacity to create beauty and goodness in the world with each other. That's kind of long-winded answer to your question.
I love all of that. All of that. Yeah. One of the things that captured my heart early on when I met Jesus was that he doesn't try and power play his position as God to get me to be a part of his story, that he comes into my story in the incarnation, and he walks out my story so that he can say, I know what that feels like. And then he invites me into his story, right? And that's a God I can actually follow, Right. That's a God I can actually follow. So I'm with you on all sorts of levels. I think this conversation will have all sorts of tangents. I want to jump into shame. So to speak. Like you said, professional sinner. I jump into shame all the time. Right. I know how to tread.
I have a pool of it in my backyard.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in my living room. So you'll probably have some laughter for this statement, but shame is a discovery that Brene Brown. This is like no one knew what shame was until Brene Brown. That seems to be the case. People all of a sudden are becoming like aware to it, but people have been talking, as your book points out, like almost every generation, like somebody will bring up shame and it'll be like revolutionary. You probably have thoughts as to why that's the case, but maybe just bring us up to speed on shame and where we're at with it. But also it's fun in your book. I noticed that you didn't say a working definition. You said a working description of shame, and you spend the first chapter on that. So maybe just a working description when we're trying to actually understand what the heck is shame. Right.
Well, I think our listeners at one level don't need me to tell them what it is, right? We all kind of know. And we use different words to describe it. I can say, I feel ashamed. I feel embarrassed. I feel humiliated, maybe in my most intense moments. The word contempt is a word that is associated with it, which is important because contempt has a certain intentionality about it in which we are kind of foisting shame on someone else, but we do the same thing to ourselves. One of the things I point out is that shame, and this is really important for us to be aware of, that shame is primarily, first and foremost, a neurophysiological event. And we talk about it as if whereas it is this kind of abstract idea,
Yeah.
and we associate it with particular events in our life where I felt ashamed when my dad did this or this happened at work and so forth, all of which is true.
Mm.
And at the same time, what's important to know is that the real thing that we're experiencing because we are embodied creatures. It is a thing that actively takes place in our brain and in our bodies. Mm. And there are some features about it that are crucially important from that standpoint. Mm. One is that it starts early in our life. We can begin to experience it as early as 15 to 18 months of age, which is long before we have language. For most of us, we don't have much language at 15 to 18 months of age, which means we can't make sense of what's happening to us. We just have to somehow find a way to cope with it. And because we don't have language and we don't ask our parents, Dad, why did Mom do that? We simply have to come up with a coping strategy for that, non-verbally, non-cognitively, which means our coping strategies begin to develop the way we cope with it, the way we respond to it, including all of our hiding, all of our disintegrated states. All those kinds of things happen long before we are aware that we're actually doing it. So it's, as we say, disintegrating, meaning that it's very difficult for me to bring together my thinking and my feeling and my body, my embodied states together as a one coherent whole when shame has its way with me, because it's difficult for me to do those kinds of things. It causes me to actively hide. And by this, I don't just mean, again, kind of metaphorically. I mean, literally, our bodies turn away from people. We've all seen a dog feeling shame. It lowers its head, it lowers its eyes, tail between its legs. We do this in our own physical ways as human beings. You're at a cocktail party, you're talking to people, you say something, it's not received very easily or well, and you stop talking. You withdraw, like you're now hiding. You're literally, physically, by not talking, turning away. So there's the hiding. There's the crucial element of isolation. Shame isolates us, and then in order for us to cope with what we feel, we only further comply with the isolation. Shame is self-referential. I feel ashamed, and then when I'm aware that I'm ashamed, I feel even more shame as I'm feeling shame, and so it self-referentially strengthens itself. It leads eventually to what we know to be this sense of condemnation. That's the cognitive element of it. There's this condemnation. There's something wrong with me. This is what I do. Fill in the blank. I'm not this enough, not that enough, whatever that cognitive state is. And the last thing I tell folks is that it is a harbinger of something. It's a signal to something. It's not just out there in the universe, just happening to be there. It is signaling something else to us. And the something else is that it's warning us of the danger of abandonment, which speaks to this sense that we read about in Genesis 2. It's not good for the man to be alone. It's not good for us to be separate, for it to be disconnected, for us to be not with others. And this is exactly what shame does. It signals to us that aloneness in the biblical sense, which is like with a capital A, that kind of abandonment is present. It's in the room. It wants to take over. It wants to have you live as if you're living in a world of abandonment, which also points to this notion, like if I'm abandoned, my brain senses that I'm now living in a world of scarcity, as opposed to a world of abundance, a world of generosity. Tim Mackey, the Old Testament scholar who some of your listeners may know, the Bible Project, does a beautiful job of walking out the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And when, part of that, he talks about this difference between this world of scarcity and this world of abundance. And this is a lot about what shame says. Shame says that I am a person of scarcity. The world is a world of scarcity, if we were to put that into words. But mostly we sense it physiologically, emotionally, and in the depth of our bodies. And so part of what's important about how we approach it is that, we could just tell somebody, you don't need to be ashamed about that. And it's going to be less than helpful because we're talking to the parts of our brain where shame isn't really all that active.
Yeah. All of that is helpful. The particular bit about about maybe distinguishing shame from its effects, because when I look at, I feel a disconnect from maybe baby boomers. But when I look at millennials, some Gen Xers, and then the generation below millennials, like we unequivocally addicted to busyness. Like we use busyness as medication, and we use apathy as medication. So it's like busyness. It's like, okay, so I don't have to pause and look at the chaos inside of me. So I create like more chaos here, more busyness here. So I don't ever have to be attentive to that. And then apathy, where it's like, I am done feeling, right? We just turn off and we live however we want. But then there's also like hiding, where it's, you're so afraid of being a failure and a disappointment. And so you just like, because I mean, you use the word abandonment, you feel abandoned, but there's also like this idea of self-abandonment. Like I've experienced that, where I will abandon myself and I won't give myself voice or time to speak. I will hole away. And I'll often, like you say, professional sinner. Like I've referred to myself as a high functioning hider, you know, like I can come out and do the work I need to do, but man, do I hide deep when I'm not performing, you know? And so that's those three things. So the busyness, the apathy, and the hiding, that's like my lens when I look at our generation. I'm like, oh my gosh, like we hurt real big and we don't even know it. And we're just hiding from our hurt. It's hard to be honest with it, especially if you don't know a way out, you know? And some people know a way out, but it's just so darn scary. Like it takes a lot of bravery to engage this stuff. So I'm excited to be having this conversation for that reason. I do, because you point special attention to the neurobiology. So what is taking place when you encounter shame? Like what is happening? You use those words of integration and disintegration. They're major words in your work, and I was wondering if you could play that out for us some.
Well, these words, integration, disintegration, comes from the work of Dan Siegel and others, and a lot of us who've talked about this, thought about this around the question, you know, we don't need to go into here, but first of all, asking the question, what is the mind, and what does it look like if the mind is flourishing? And the example I use is that the mind is flourishing like an orchestra. So the mind has multiple different functional elements. We sense, we image, we feel, we think, we behave with our bodies. And we have different neurons, brain cells, neural networks. We have different parts of the brain that correspond with and that correlate with those different functions. And so those neurons actually function differently. So neurons that help me sense do very different things than neurons that help me move my hand, or that neurons help me think about the plan I want to make for my wife's birthday that's coming up next week, which it is. And when all of that is functioning well, it's like the brass, strings, the woodwinds, and the percussion, they're all coming together, but they need a conductor. Because what you want are parts in that orchestra that have all worked really, really hard at doing their particular, like they've practiced their particular part. That's what we call differentiation. And so we want to know that we are people who have learned to pay attention to what we pay attention to, that we've learned what we feel, that we've paid attention to what we think, we paid attention to what we sense, that these are well-developed elements of what it means for my mind to work. But it's not enough just for them to be well-developed. In the orchestra, they have to come together and listen to the other parts while they're playing their own part really well, which is a lot of work. And so we talk about this differentiation and then these parts being linked together. It's the linkage of differentiated parts that leads to flourishing systems. And this has to do with physics and quantum mechanics and a whole range of other things, but it's also true for relationships. And in order for all of that to happen well, and here's the real thing that where the biblical narrative, I think, speaks so powerfully and beautifully to this. In order for the conductor in my brain to work well for me most days, that conductor needs to be trained as a conductor. And it won't just figure this out on its own. It needs another human relationship, other human relationships to help me learn that I have these different parts and how it means to link these different parts together. When this is happening, and we talk about secure attachment in parent-child relationships that enable the child to grow into a person who has the Berlin Philharmonic. What shame does, shame brings a 4x4 pickup truck into the orchestra hall and just runs over the whole show. And so it separates different parts of the mind from other parts of the mind. So one question I ask people is like, when you're really ashamed and you feel it and sense it, how easy is it for you to think clearly? How easy is it for you to be creative? How easy is it for you to engage in humor? How easy is it for you to rest in repose physically? Whole range of ways in which we can't access other functional elements of our mind when shame shows up. One of the other metaphors that we use, I mean, this kind of gets a bit into the science of it, but we talk about shame. We talk about the mind as thinking about a standard transmission automobile. I talk about this in the book a little bit. This notion that humans, from the time they're born, are in go mode, right? This is the accelerator in a car. And little ones are in go, 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 unless they're sleeping. They're just going, 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 going. And at some point, parents and others have to help them say, no, we have to slow that system down, or else the 2-year-old is running into the street.
Yeah.
The slowing down of the engine is the brake system. And we have different parts of our brain that accelerate and different parts that brake. And the reality is that a lot of life, most of life, is lived trying to regulate the acceleration and deceleration elements of our engine. But in order for me to do that with a standard transmission automobile, I have to have a clutch. I have to have something that can help me downshift, help me kind of bring my car into neutral and sit at the traffic light if I need to. But with that, if I don't have a clutch, like my engine doesn't just die, it dies violently. And what is that clutch? The clutch are deeply connected interpersonal human relationships. That's how I learn to move from acceleration to deceleration in any way, shape, or form. But a perfect example of deceleration would be, the kid who's 10 years old who comes in with a 92% on his test score to his dad. He's accelerated. He is coming. I got something to show my dad. And I say, Dad, look what I got on my test. And Dad says, where's the other 8%? And suddenly, somebody has slammed on the brakes for this kid's brain, and there's no clutch. And so what does this kid learn? This kid learns to splice together. This kid learns that shame will now be neurally knit together with joy. And there will be all kinds of consequences for this if this is the kind of house that he's living in, right? He will learn not to reveal things to other people that might be joyful to him, and so forth and so on. And so one of the things then we learn about this from a mechanical, from an interpersonal standpoint, is that, as I said, we start this process when we're really, really young. And so we've been practicing it. We're really good at shame. Like, we're really good at it.
Yeah.
And it's like any really good or well-ingrained bad habit. I have to unlearn it, and I have to practice, and I first have to identify that it's happening. I can't just ignore it. I have to go find it. I have to identify where it's happening. And in that moment where I discover it, I then turn my attention to a different path that gives me a very, very different, not just abstract message, not just you don't have to be ashamed of this, but a very different, viscerally felt, embodied experience, which is, in the book, we kind of go after this, John 21, where Jesus comes for Peter's shame on the beach. He's going to be unrelenting. He's not going to let any of that be left underneath any stones.
All of that is helpful. My thoughts instantly splinter. Shows my disintegration, I think.
Or your creativity.
There you have it. I do want to. So the existential reality. Do you? I just want to. This is backtracking a little bit, but do you agree with? And she even acknowledges that this is simplistic, but guilt, feeling bad for what you've done, shame, feeling bad for who you are.
So there's some really lovely research that has looked at guilt and differentiates guilt from shame. And I think that linguistic picture, right? Guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. That picture's been around for a long, long time and is an accurate portrayal. What's interesting about this is that if you look at children, adolescents, high school, college, 20, 30-year-olds, where a lot of the research has been done, if you look at their response behaviorally, when they experience something, the phenomenon that we call guilt, you will find that if they experience something in which they've done something that's hurt the feelings of somebody else or done something wrong to someone that they care about, right, with someone with whom they have an important relationship, you will find that one of the first maneuvers that they make is to move toward that person in order to seek repair. There's a felt sense of, I want to correct this as quickly as we can. I want to seek your forgiveness. Now, one of the interesting things then that we discover is that when one senses shame, you don't do that.
Yeah.
You still continue to turn away from people. And I would suggest that there are some elements, and this is what the research also would indicate. First of all, as we said, the thing that we call shame shows up early, 15 to 18 months of life. The phenomenon that we call guilt does not begin to emerge in children until they're probably about 4 to 6 years of age. And we speculate, I mean, we maybe not know this absolute, but we speculate that a lot of that has to do with brain development. A lot of it has to do with the sense that, like, shame, this sense that, like, I am bad, begins at a time when a child's brain really only senses necessarily themselves. We presume they don't have a sense of differentiating themselves from other people. When my prefrontal cortex begins to develop,
excuse me,
I then have a greater sense that, like, there's me and there's you.
Yeah. And
so I can do a thing that hurts our relationship. And I can sense that your feelings might be hurt by what I've done. And I can sense that separation, and I want to do something to close the gap on that. But I'm only really able to do that because my brain is developed enough to let me differentiate from you and have the sense that there is another human being that's in play here, but also to recognize that there is a me and then there is my behavior. Early on, when we sense shame, that differentiation isn't really going on. So it's very difficult for me to sense anything. If I sense something bad, like, it's all on me. It's all about me. And so this is one of the other things that we recognize, is that we do something wrong. We move to apologize. And the person says, we're good. Thank you. And you work it out. And the next day, you're thinking about that thing and you're still feeling bad.
Yeah.
You remember what your friend said. And we might say, I still feel guilty.
Yeah.
To which I would say, actually, you're now not talking about guilt any longer. You're talking about shame.
That's good. Yeah.
And that's an important thing, because it really reminds us that if for shame to be fully healed, it requires somebody else to come and find me. It's very difficult for me to regulate that on my own.
Yeah, no, that's huge. There are, to lean into the punch a bit, there are memories that I have that I don't know how to inhabit. And to some extent, I quarantine off in my mind, because when I go there, they just wreck me. You know, like I don't know what to do with them. Like I go there and I just have no idea.
Right. Yeah. Right on.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really good. And it is interesting to note that even a lot of the shame we experience, when it's played out, we put virtue language around it. Like we'll say like someone is such a hard worker, you know, or we'll say somebody is such a good manager while they mistreat their employees by trying to get them to work up to a performance level that they themselves can't match, you know? And so I don't know how I'll ask this. Dan Allender, he's real big into kind of like a core name. So for instance, when I read his book, it was probably 2 years ago, and that book wrecked my junk just as much as yours, but,
which one?
To Be Told.
Oh, yeah.
And he's done a ton of work on contempt. In that book, To Be Told, he does a lot of work on exile when it comes to abandonment. But in that one, he deals a lot with core name and understanding your name in the story that you believe, and who are the characters, what are the themes of trauma and whatnot. Right. And so for me, coming out of that, like I walked away with the name, understanding the name failure. Shame seems to be interesting. I feel shame the most when it pits me against something that is impossible. So failure, especially with memories, it's like, well, I can't ever go back. You know, like I can't ever redo those things. I was talking to a close friend the other day, and for her, disappointment, but it wasn't just disappointment. It was disappointment with the expectation to solve what can't be solved, you know? And I don't know if that's just a narrow observation of shame, or if shame regularly pits us against something that is impossible and says, no, this is your responsibility. And so it's almost like it's playing a game that you've never played before with rules that are variable all the time, you know, and you're just getting smashed by them. Is that a feature of the phenomenon of shame that you've observed, or is that, again, just a myopic view?
Well, no, I don't think it's myopic. In fact, I would extend that into from a theological perspective. We might say that every moment that we inhabit is a potential moment in which we co-labor with God to create beauty and goodness in the world. Every conversation we have, every outing to the grocery store, there is the potential for us to be open to and attuned to the possibility of creating. This is anathema to evil. And so, to your point, anytime we imagine that we are about to do anything, the reality is it holds potential and possibility for the creation of beauty and goodness. Now, our imaginations are so underdeveloped that it's really difficult for us to imagine that this is really the case in our world.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Like we all need to like read the whole Narnia series, right? Like a dozen times.
Yes. Yeah.
Before we should be allowed to like leave the house.
Yeah.
And then we can go live in the world and be open to it. And so, to your point, if it's true that every moment is pregnant in its own particular way with the possibility of creativity, of new creation, and evil is the antithesis of that, it will use shame as a way to twist the way that we tell the story that we imagine that we're in at that moment. And so, so somebody gives us an opportunity and we think it's a responsibility, or we think about doing something and we turn it into a responsibility that we are sure we're not going to be able to meet, because shame is necessarily going to be put into play as a way to make sure that no new thing is made. Even if the new thing that is made is the discovery in my own mind and heart of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be willing to take the risk of trying something where I might make a mistake and wait for God to find me. Like, that's new trust. Evil cannot tolerate this. because that kind of first step, only leads to more beauty and goodness, only leads to more first forms of the new heaven and the new earth that are coming, is only that's like the foothills of practicing for heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love all of that. It's actually a good traversal point, because you spend an intentional amount of time looking at the biblical story. You make a point early on that one of the domains of the mind is narrative. And from pretty early on, we start to form a story that makes the most sense out of reality, out of our experiences. And there are always stories within stories within stories. But you make the point that basically anytime we talk, we're telling a story,
Well, we might say there is no time at all that we are conscious that we are not telling a story.
There you have it. Yes, yes. So when it comes to, and I like this, learning how to, being intentional with the story you live in, and not something that's just fantastical, but also the story that we all long for and makes the most sense out of reality, because it's not just wishful thinking. So when you look at the biblical narrative, what story do you see, and what kind of story do you see God inviting us to live into?
Well, I would say again, for me, this is where I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of people here, right? Scholars, biblicists, others who have really who've written and described ways of thinking about, in particular, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But then in particular also to see how Jesus is the culmination, right? Everything.
He's awesome.
Is about the King.
Yeah. And
so this whole notion of, we ask our patients, this question, right? In what story do you believe you're living? And they're like, what the heck?
Yeah.
I don't know, what the heck are you talking? What do you mean?
Yeah.
I'm in this really bad marriage. That's what I mean. Well, that's what you're telling me. But I also want you to be aware that that's a story that you're actually telling, but I don't know that has to necessarily be the story that you're living in. Right? It's just you're telling me about your perception from your vantage point about the things you're experiencing. But as we all know, we all stand on four corners at an intersection, watch an auto accident happen, and we got four different stories about what's happening, what's most important, what captures our attention. And out of this first 11 chapters of Genesis, we see, again, referring to Tim Mackey's work, we see this notion of, first of all, this sense that we are living in a world in which we're choosing between, do we live in a world of abundance or do I live in a world of scarcity? And shame is all about playing into that latter narrative.
Because shame shows up early on there in Scripture. It's right there with that sin. So that does seem pertinent, doesn't it?
Right. And I also would say that just the notion of, I think it's interesting. The word shows up at the end of Genesis chapter 2. The man and his wife were naked and unashamed. And the Hebrews had lots of words that they could have described their state. They were naked and unafraid. They were naked and confident, naked and a range of different things. The writer chooses that word, I would say, for at least, my wandering, for a couple of reasons. One, of course, it sets us up for the next chapter. It gets us ready. It primes us for what's coming. Yeah. But the other thing that it does is it tells a very important story right then and there at the end of Genesis chapter 2, that they are living on the edge of, remember, this is, if you follow Genesis 1 into Genesis 2, they're living at the edge of day 7 and 8. They're still living into Sabbath.
Yeah.
And they are standing at the precipice of, what does it mean for us to launch into our humanity? What does it mean for us to take on the role of stewards of this world? And we see that conditions for that are that we are naked, right? We are vulnerable creatures. We don't have to make ourselves be that. Like, we are that. That's why we wear clothes. We are differentiated. The man and his wife were naked. So for me to be creative, for me to create and steward, I'm doing this with my vulnerability and with differentiation. I'm not doing it with, like, it's easy to, I can think it's easy for me to like make something with all the people that I love, right? But you read the annals of like Abraham Lincoln, he surrounded himself, right, with a group of people that didn't get along with each other because he wanted other voices in the room. We need to be differentiated. We need to be vulnerable, and we need to do it in the absence of shame. They were naked and they were unashamed. In the absence of shame, there is no boundary to the potential for the creativity of goodness and beauty that God has stored up for us from before the foundation of the world. But evil uses shame to begin to tell a different story in the first place, right? Evil doesn't just walk in and say, all the rules are wrong. No, he invites the woman into a narrative. Did God say? What's that about? What's the meaning of this? Where, like, God, it turns out, is stingy. God, as it turns out, doesn't want you to have what he has. He doesn't want you eating. He doesn't want you having the knowledge that God has. But you can be like this. And what strikes me here is that, if the woman and the man had such a tight, they're developing their relationship with God. They're early in the game in this, as far as this text is concerned, and they're still having to. And there is a wound that takes place. And I want to invite our listeners to consider that when the evil tells the story the way it does, he's not just telling the story out into the neutral ether. It's a wounding story. It is intended to wound her, to shame her, without doing so directly. So when dad asks his son, who's showing him the 92% on his math test, where's the other 8%? He doesn't say to his son directly, you're really not a very good student, are you? You're an idiot.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't. It's much more subtle than that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure dad has his own longing, and dad has his own desire. Dad has his own fear, right? That if my son doesn't perform at then what will it mean for me as a dad? All those kinds of things. But the point being that, notice that evil does not directly confront the story of God. Evil obliquely does this. And then leaves the woman to make up a story in her head. Notice, evil doesn't say, I think we should, let's continue this conversation before you eat any fruit. Let's continue the conversation and wait till God comes around this evening with his evening walk, and we'll check this out. No. As long as I am left to have to work this out in the privacy of my own mind. Now, the text doesn't tell us, did she go and have a conversation with Adam? They're working this out together. C.S. Lewis's work, Paralandra, is a beautiful exposition of this, right? Because she's left on her own and the king is left on his own as they're trying to work out what they have to work out. But this is where shame takes up residence, and the context in which shame works most powerfully, which is when we are in private. And that story begins to work its way into her heart. And what I suggest is that, if shame starts to do its work in me, I need to find a coping strategy. My husband's not helping me. God's not here yet. I don't have the wherewithal to wait. And the knowing, by taking the fruit, everything else had been given to me. This I take. The knowing helps me cope with my shame. So we take all kinds of things. We take with our sexuality, we take with our materialism, we take with our, you name it. We take as a way to cope with my shame, only to reinforce it. And then we notice that as the text progresses, and their eyes were opened. Notice that it is not an active verb. There's not a sense in which she opened her eyes and saw. He opened his eyes. Their eyes were open. There's this sense in which shame does something to us. And then I act in response to it, and my actions in response, they do even more to me and to others. Mm. We get the sense that if their eyes are going to be opened by what? Well, there's only two players as far as we can see. So we can imagine, gosh, is she opening his eyes and he's opening hers? Like, gosh, you put on a lot of weight since we've been eating from this tree. I mean, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then as such, hiding ensues. So anyway, I'll stop with that, but it's a lot.
This is really good. And I do want to, this will be the last question, but I'll make it a big question. A lot of my peers feel shame when they look at the cross. They look at the cross and the story they hear is, you're so awful that nothing could save you except for the death of someone who's actually good. They hear that story and variations of it with hookup culture. Like, there's this narrative I see in my peers that every relationship I'm in is damned to fail. With pornography, it's I repent, I feel awful, and God doesn't save me. I keep on falling prey to this again, and it's my own actions. No, I can't blame anything except for myself, but I need someone to save me, and God doesn't save me. So he loves, I still believe he loves everybody, just not me. I believe he can save everybody, just not me.
Right. I don't mean to laugh at that. I just never really heard it put quite like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What a helpful, powerful way of framing how shame operates. Like, it's not just that we're all screwed. Like, no, I believe God can save everybody, just not me.
Yeah. It's gnarly. It's absolutely gnarly. So when I was reading just yesterday, I'll read the verse because it's so beautiful. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses. By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame, triumphing over them in it. This ridiculous idea of our shame being tacked onto his body, and then him taking that shame and killing it by allowing himself to die. Really remarkable picture. But that's one that my generation, just because I know my generation best, really struggles with. Just seeing that Jesus doesn't just love them because they have to, but actually likes them. That he likes me, that he likes spending time with me. He could have snapped him his fingers and made me perfect, but he likes the journey with me. So when it comes to like shame, because as you say, like, you'll reconcile with an individual if you're just brave enough and you're like, hey, this hurt me. And then all of a sudden, but then the next morning you feel it again. And it feels especially stupid to have to go to them again and say, I need you to apologize to me again because I'm still hurt. And so what does it look like to actively partner with Jesus? To hear him say, I know what that feels like, and I still love you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're not a disappointment to me. You're not a failure to me. Right. And to then know the good news of his gospel, to know that there is resurrection in the Jesus way.
Yeah. Well, Shane, I'm struck by a number of things that come out of the Gospel of John in the post-resurrection stories, which we don't really get as much of in the synoptic Gospels. I'm struck by the notion that even in the face of resurrection, it would appear to be about 6 weeks later that Jesus still has to come for Peter. The resurrection in and of itself has not yet fully delivered Peter. Not because the resurrection in and of itself is not powerful enough to do it, but because God takes us so seriously. So much does he love us. Like, we do not comprehend how seriously, lovingly he takes us. So to your point about partnering with us, this has been from the beginning. It was God's intention to partner with Adam and Eve. It was God's intention then to partner with Noah, to partner with Abraham, to partner with Israel. And as it turns out, we have to wait for Jesus before we find the one who partners with God. I do that which I see my Father doing. We're partnering. And God continues to partner with us at every single point of redemption. And so there is a role that only Jesus can play. And so we would say that, it's like, look, I don't need anybody to tell me I'm a sinner. I'm well aware that I'm screwed. Screwed up, and it's like I'm well aware of this. And so I don't need preachers to tell me this. I don't need my parents, my wife, I don't need people to tell me this. Like, I'm a professional sinner. Like, I get it. What I need is for people to invite me to imagine a different way of understanding crucifixion. I don't need to be reminded that my sin put Jesus on the cross. Like, that's not much of a leap for me. Like, I get that. Yeah, I get it. What I need help with is imagining, I pause for just a moment. Not that long ago, I had the chance to be in Israel a few years ago. And, in that, we talked about and had an upfront and close experience of what crucifixion was like. And, our artwork, as it turns out, doesn't very well portray it, right? Because crucifixion was not held at 50 yards away on a cross, 10 feet in the air with, loincloths and so forth and so on. They're beaten to a pulp. They're stripped completely naked. They're stuck on a post in which they're probably elevated no more than about 8 inches, 12 inches maybe off the ground. And the posts are typically stuck on the side of the road. So if you want to see Jesus, you can pretty much probably look him right in the eye and see everything you want to see right up close and personal, which is almost too much to imagine. And here's the thing. For us to actually see that, what we're seeing is Jesus saying to us, look, I already know where your shame is. And I'm coming to be with it. And I'm coming in such a way that you will be left with no doubt that I know what shame feels like, that I know what this means to take your shame on, because I literally am going to enter into a form of execution that most historians would suggest has never been bested than what the Romans used to do to people. And this represents, I tell people, just imagine this. Imagine that you are a home that has many different rooms in it. And in each room, you've got your own particular storage closet where you keep your shame for that particular room. And you think that what you really want to do is consider if I want to invite Jesus first, even into my foyer, and then I might consider inviting him into any of these rooms. And that's all backward. You see, Jesus wants to say to us, excuse me, I'm already waiting for you in the room because I've already been in the closet. And you didn't know, you come into this room, I'm not leaving because I've been there, and I want you to see me seeing you in your shame. And then us together begin to tell a very different story about what that all means. And this is what I would suggest he begins to do with Peter in John 21. He comes for Peter. Look, all these guys, resurrection, it's great, maybe, but they're all going back to their old jobs, right? They're all out fishing because it's too much. And so, for your people, for our, for us. I mean, we say like every generation has to preach the gospel afresh. Every generation has to have a new encounter with its own shame and allow Jesus to meet them in the way that he needs to.
That's good. Yeah.
Because not just in my own heart do I hide personally, but generationally and societally, we find ways to hide shame. And God will come for it again when the next generation shows up. And so to our friends who are listening, I would say, I want you to know that the gaze of Jesus that we read about in Luke's gospel, when Peter denies him for the third time, and Jesus looked at Peter straight in the eye, we have artwork that would depict this sad look on Jesus' face, this turning away on Peter's part, this sense that everybody's upset. And I wonder, is it not possible that what Peter could have seen had he looked long enough would have been a look in Jesus' eye that says, I know what you've done. I knew it before it. I'm not worried. I'll see you in 3 days. Be ready for when I find you. And I want our people to hear that. That when we look at crucifixion through the lens of Easter, we're looking at the most beautiful thing in the world. But because of Easter, and because of Easter, Jesus continues to come to find us.
I like you, Curt. I like you a lot. Thank you for sharing not just your thoughts with us, but your heart with us. As I noted earlier, this stuff is ravishing us, and it is interesting. So sometimes I'll conceive of memories as rooms. It's like, I just can't go into that room. And there have been like a few occasions where Jesus will say, "It's okay. It's not a light switch. I installed a dimmer." And he's gentle, and he's like, no, buddy, I'm not just going to blind you with light. We're going to look at this slowly together, but I'm going to be with you. And it's just like, oh, you're Lord of the room. You're Lord of the dimmer switch, and just how gentle he is in that process. He really is so very extraordinary. No one has ever believed in me. And that's a weird thing. No one's ever believed in me the way Jesus has believed in me.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Curt, we with all my heart, I wish we had another hour. We don't. I hope you will join us again sometime in the future, because this has been really good. How can people two quick questions. One, how can people stay in touch with your thoughts? I don't know if there's a book you want to put out there, or if there's I don't know if you write elsewhere or anything like that. So one, how can people just track with you? And two, how can people be praying for you?
Wow. Thank you. The first is they can track with me through my website. It's CurtThompsonMD.com. And there you'll find, among other things, you'll find an option if you wanted. If you want to check out The Soul of Shame as a book, you can download a free chapter from there, from the website. And also you can look at the first book, Anatomy of the Soul. There are also a number of interactive resources that are on my website where people can engage with reflections, artwork, music, a number of things that are an attempt to help people tell their story more truly. That's one thing. And I'll just say this much, in September, we'll be releasing a book, the title of which is going to be The Soul of Desire. And it's really going to be looking at this question of longing, beauty, and community, and what that means as an answer to not just shame itself, but to so much of what, it leads to, not least of which what we're seeing in our country, now in a widespread way. And, thank you so much. You're so kind to ask about how you can pray for me. I would say, I'm 58 and I'm trying to figure out like what I'm going to do when I grow up. I'm trying to discern these things, and I discover after 58 years I still got stuff. I have things I'm like for crying out loud, why couldn't I have taken care of this when I was 18 and not 40 years later? Whatever these things are. And so I think the prayer, I would appreciate prayer for, I think just two things. One is that I would be able to really lean into what it means to persevere. Because there's just things that, things that you do, patterns that just old things where shame just keeps showing up over and over and over. Kind of like Moses, like he never really got over his anger. Yeah. Right. You got better at it, but never got over it. Yeah. I got my kind of things with those things. And I think then the second thing is I'm really trying to, with the new book coming and other opportunities and options, really just trying to steward that wisely. And so I would be appreciative of prayer for wisdom in stewarding the gifts that God has put before me. So. Because my own shame will worry that somehow I'm misappropriating these things. I'm not getting them done. I'm not blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
We will absolutely be with you in all of that. A number of people regularly reach out and mention that they are praying. So it's fun. It's fun because Christians are listening, Christians pray, and while getting off a podcast as they're driving home, it's easy to shoot up a prayer. So we would be honored to pray for you and pray with you into those things. And thank you so much for joining us and just being with us and sharing yourself.
Oh, this is Shane. This has just been it's just such a pleasure, and I just thank you for. I mean, dude, like piercing the darkness, man. Like it's what you're doing, and I'm just. Proud of you, grateful for your work. I mean, the gates of hell will not stand against Jesus coming. And like you're like you're like an outpost of beauty and goodness that just bears witness to that. So thank you.
We receive it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Curt.
Yeah, right on.
Guys, thank you for joining us here at The Naked Gospel, where you get to regularly listen to me cry with my guests. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for this conversation that we were able to have with Curt. It is just really amazing. I am so grateful for his work. Do check that out. We'll have links below so you can check out all the things that he was referencing. And do want to continue to reiterate that that Jesus cares quite deeply about us. And he went through so much that he could say to us, I know what that feels like. I came across this phrase recently, co-sufferer. Like we go through stuff, and to think of Jesus as a co-sufferer, that he intentionally went through all that he could go through so that he could be beside me as I go through my life is truly incredible. And I want to know him. I want to know him that way when it speaks to the dignity of my body and the value of my body, as well as the value of my imagination and my mind, and what it looks like to live an integrated life with relationships and with people. So thank you for joining us. Do leave reviews, likes, comments, whatever, and we will catch you guys next time. Thanks for joining us.